Hello again, this is Adam from ClockSpring. Today, we're going to integrate data from Rsam into ServiceNow. In this scenario, we have two different systems of record. We have Rsam, which is responsible for performing risk assessments against our third-party vendors, and we have ServiceNow, which is responsible for managing contracts, again, across these same vendors. And we've been tasked to publish the risk assessment results from Rsam into the contracts database inside ServiceNow. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is to connect to Rsam and query the results of the saved search that contains all of our assessments. To do so, we'll need a new process group to retrieve that data. Clicking on the Import button connects us to the ClockSpring repository. And the bucket drop-down shows some of our default templates. We'll select Rsam as the bucket, and then we'll select Query Save Search as a flow. Now when we click the Import button, we get a framework which simplifies connecting to the Rsam application. The blue box on the top left shows the input and output parameters required to make this template operate. Selecting the Settings menu brings up the parameters that we can apply to this template. We have the Rsam parameter context already defined, which sets the API key which we need to authenticate. Next, we'll take a look at the required parameters. Here we see we need the Rsam search ID, which is the internal Rsam ID for the saved search that we want to execute. Stepping back out to the main flow, now we need to define that saved search. So I'll create a new processor, and we'll use the update attribute processor in order to set that value. We'll draw a line from that processor into the input of the template. Now we'll double click on that update attribute processor and we can set some of these parameters. First thing is we'll give it a good name. So we'll rename it to setSearchID. Next, we'll set the search ID that we want to execute. We'll create a new property with the name from the template, which is searchRsamID. And here we'll paste in the internal Rsam ID of the search that we want to execute. Now we need to start the flow. To do that, we'll use the generate flow file processor, which will instantiate a brand new flow. We'll draw the line to connect it to the main flow, and then double click on it, and again we'll give it a better name. So we'll call this one instantiate sync. Now we'll go over to the scheduling tab to set the execution schedule. By default, the integration is going to run continuously, but that's not really what we want to do here, so we'll update it to run every 1 day. Now we're ready to start the flow. So on the instantiate sync processor, I'll right click and select start. Now again, I'll do the same thing on that setSearchID processor, and I'll double click on the template and we can start the input here. Now when I refresh the screen, we'll see there's one item in the queue directly above the processor which executes the saved search. So right clicking on this, I'll do a list queue so we can actually see the details of what's going to be sent to that processor. And here we have that searchRsamID, which was the required input. So when I start this processor, it's going to execute an API call to Rsam and retrieve the data from that saved search. So when I refresh the screen, now on the response side, I do see one item in the queue there as well. So I'm going to just start the rest of the flow and we'll trickle down a little bit and do some of our post-processing on that data, one of which was to split it into individual records. So looking at the queue, we see 5 items now instead of the 1 previously. And clicking on the eyeball, we can actually take a look and see what the data looks like in the flow. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here is the prefix on these identifiers. So we have an object attribute, a unique identifier, and that weird little hook character. Now, because we're using the template, we have steps that automatically sanitize that data so that it's easier to process later. So I'm going to start these next 2 items in the flow, and we'll take a look at the data after that process has completed. Now what you'll notice is the prefix is gone and that suffix is gone as well. So we have some nice JSON which is going to be easy to manipulate and easy to get into attributes to pass into ServiceNow. So let's start that process. We'll go out to the main canvas again and capture the data that we need to send to ServiceNow. So we'll create a new processor called evaluate JSON path. And this will let us select the JSON from Rsam and convert it into an attribute that we can then send to ServiceNow. So we'll draw the connection from the Rsam result, and we want the successfully executed output. And then we'll start the group so that the data is routed to the next stage. So now we need to pull out the attributes from the safe search that we want to send to ServiceNow. And we'll do that using JSON path. So we'll go to this website, it's jasonpath.com, which is an online evaluator, which makes it easy to build the expressions to pull out this data. So we'll paste one of the Rsam results in here, and we'll take a look at the data. The third from the bottom is the name key, and that's associated with CC Payment Inc. So in the JSON path syntax column, I do $.name, and that will find that key. So looking on the right, you see the results. So I'm just going to copy this value and then move on over into the processor. And the first thing that I need to do is update the properties so that we move to an attribute instead of the content. Then I'm going to create a new property, and I'm going to call it the name, because that's the attribute in ServiceNow where this data has to go. I'll paste in the JSON path, and we're done. So now we need to do the same for the other attributes that we're interested in. So we'll create a new property, and then we'll go back to the JSON path evaluator and look at the other attributes that we're interested in. So we've got the inherent risk rating, the residual risk rating, inherent risk score, and residual risk score. Now these are the attributes that we want to capture. I'm going to start with the inherent risk score. And what I'll do, I'll copy that, and then go back over to ClockSpring so we can add it as an attribute. Now the property name in ServiceNow is U_inherent risk score. So we'll set that to match. And then we'll set the value based off of the JSON returned from Rsam. All right, next we need to do the same thing for the residual risk. So we've got the new property U_residual risk score. And then we'll map it back again to the residual risk score from the Rsam data. Now we need to go about mapping the inherent risk and residual risk ratings. Now looking at the inherent risk, you'll see the value is 4 high, and residual risk, it's 2 low. Now this doesn't map to our attributes in ServiceNow because the list box in ServiceNow omits that prefixed number. So what we'll have to do is create a mapping between the value in Rsam and the value in ServiceNow. But before we can do that, we have to map the attributes. So going back to ClockSpring, we'll create a new property, and this one we'll call R_inherent risk. And I'll use the R prefix rather than the U prefix just to delineate that this is a reference parameter. And I'll paste in the data from the inherent risk key. And then I'll do the same thing for the residual risk. I'll do R_residual risk for the key. And we'll set the residual risk as the value. And now we have the data mapped. So I have all of the attributes from Rsam mapped into attributes within ClockSpring so that we can start manipulating them. And the first thing that we need to do is to create that mapping between the inherent risk rating and residual risk rating from Rsam and the values in ServiceNow. And to do so, we'll need a new processor to define those mappings. So what we'll do is we'll create a new lookup attribute processor and add that to our stage. I'll connect the results with the mapped attributes from Rsam using the success criteria. And then we'll update the configuration on the extract JSON. We'll give it a better name, extract attributes to send to snow. And then we need to terminate the failure and unmatched conditions to allow this processor to start. And, oh, we've got an error. So what's going on? The U residual risk score is invalid. Oh. So what I need to do is I need to just add the bracket around this. It wasn't valid JSON path. Now when I close this up, you can see that it changed from a caution sign to a red square, and we're ready to start. Now I start this processor, and looking in the queue, I can take a look at the data. Clicking on the attributes tab, I can scroll down and I see that R inherent risk attribute and the U inherent risk score. So the attributes did map properly, which means that we have the data that we need to build that lookup service. So let's navigate back to the stage. And we've got this lookup attribute. I'll double click on this. And there's a lookup service, which I've already defined. I've got this risk lookup service. So let's navigate. We'll drill into this and take a look at how that mapping is created. So clicking on the little gear icon, I'll look at the properties and see the mapping. So here I've got very low with the 1 prefix mapped to very low, low to low, medium to medium, high to high, and critical to critical. Let's go back to the stage and we'll start defining these mappings. So again, double clicking on the processor, we'll create a new property, and this is going to be U_inherent risk, which is the column inside ServiceNow that we're mapping to. And then the value is going to be the attribute that we already have stored. So this is the R_inherent risk. And what this will do is it'll map the value from that R inherent risk, which we have, and we'll create a new attribute for U inherent risk, which will be the mapped value. Now we need to do the same thing for the residual risk. The property is going to be U_residual risk, and then we'll map that to the R_residual risk attribute, which we pulled out previously. Now we've got all the data that we need in the right format, so it's time to connect it to ServiceNow. We'll go back to our templates, and we'll select a new template. This time we'll look at the ServiceNow template, and we're going to create a new ServiceNow record. And then click Import to add it to the canvas. So if we double click on this, we can view the details, which shows that this needs attributes, which we already have, and then a table to store the data. We also need to configure this group to use the ServiceNow parameter context. And this will set the ServiceNow URL and the username and password that's used to post the data into ServiceNow. The other thing that we need to do is we need to update the invoke HTTP processor to use that ServiceNow password. Since it is a protected field, it doesn't come over by default with the template. Going back to the main stage, now we need to set the table that we're going to send the data to. So again, we'll use the update attribute processor and add it to the stage. Now we will connect it from that lookup attribute processor under the match criteria, and we'll update that lookup attribute processor just to terminate any failures or any unmatched criteria. And then we'll start that processor, and we'll draw the line from the update attribute into the input for the ServiceNow request. Now we'll edit the update attribute processor, and we'll add a new attribute for the table name. Now the table name that we need to connect to is called the core company table inside ServiceNow, so that's what we'll set. When we start that update attribute processor, we'll see the one item in the queue. Let's take a look at that. We'll look at the attribute, and we can see the attributes that we had previously, as well as the updated core company. And right below, we also have that U inherent risk value and the U residual risk value, which shows the mapped values. These are the values that exist in ServiceNow that we're going to post to ServiceNow so they can be updated properly. Let's go back to the main canvas, and we'll start this integration. By double-clicking on that Create ServiceNow record, we'll start the main input, as well as a processor below which converts the attributes into the JSON format. And then we'll just start everything. Now if we refresh the screen, I see a response. We have 5 records as a response. Let's take a look at the data that came back. We'll format it into an actual JSON format. And it shows a valid ServiceNow result. This means that the commit did work, and we have successfully updated ServiceNow. Taking a look at the attributes, we see it was created by admin, which was the user that we have set to create this, and the sysID of the record that was created. So now it's time to go into ServiceNow, and let's validate the data in that system. So I'm just going to log in. I'm going to log in using the admin credentials. I'm going to search for the vendor application. And now going back to the results, the name here again is Cockatiel Consulting. I'm just going to copy and paste Cockatiel in here to the search. And I have my result. So this is a new result. Opening, and I see again inherent risk here is set to low. Inherent risk score is 31, which are the values we submitted when we created the request. That means we're done. So let's recap. What have we done here? First, we sent a request to Rsam to retrieve the risk analysis results from all of our vendors. Then, we updated some of those values to map them to the internal values that ServiceNow uses. And finally, we sent a request to ServiceNow to update the existing records inside ServiceNow for the vendors. And the best part, we did it in under 15 minutes.